Good morning, good afternoon. We will get started here in just a few minutes, so just be patient with us. Again, just good morning, good afternoon. Just want to thank everyone for joining us today. We're going to give it another minute or two to let some people finish joining the room, and then we will get started. All right, just want to thank everyone again for joining us today. My name is Carrie Kernan, and I am the Senior Manager of Sales Development at TPGI. Just want to go through a few housekeeping items before we get started. The session is being recorded, and we will email everyone the recording after the event. We have captions available, so feel free to use them as needed. We will have time for live Q&A, so please use the Q&A box, and we will answer as many questions as we can. Sometimes we miss questions when they get put in the chat, so request to try to keep them in the Q&A box. And lastly, I'd like to also mention if anyone needs any accessibility support, training, or usability testing, I will send out an email with a link to schedule a time to speak with one of our experts after the webinar. With that, I will let Mark get started and provide an introduction of himself.
Hi, thank you everyone for joining. We really appreciate everybody finding time for us here midweek, and we're going to be covering shifting accessibility from project to progress. I'm Mark Miller. I've been in digital accessibility for over a decade now. I work with the W3C on their maturity task force, which is creating a maturity model through the W3C. And I'm director of sales here at TPGI. So let's get started. What we're going to cover today is first, we're going to talk a little bit about what accessibility is, and then what accessibility maturity is, steps along that journey, and then we'll go through some resources for you all. So the first thing to really understand, of course, is what digital accessibility is, and that inclusivity in digital accessibility really helps everyone. So when you create a technology that can use by everyone, including people using assistive technologies, so we know that people who have vision impairments, for example, might use magnifiers or screen readers. You provide a better experience for all users. And we have a couple of examples on the screen of just things that you might see in your common everyday interactions that people appreciate assistive technologies and accessibility on. So we've got a remote control for the television, and we've got a couple of different a couple of different phones that are displaying different kind of apps on them, right? And of course, we know that digital accessibility includes the web. It includes a lot of tools that we use in our workday, and you know, in the web, it's really accommodating our lives in several different ways, including you know, shopping and work and booking, you know, travel, all sorts of things. So what makes a scalable program? So when you're an organization and you're producing one of these digital assets, right? We're really probably going to think mostly today about websites, digital applications, that kind of thing. For accessibility to scale, you must mature the capabilities across that organization and bake accessibility into your daily practices. And that is in contrast to having something like an audit done, fixing those issues based on the information provided in the audit, and then sort of moving on, right? That is kind of a project-based approach. What we're talking about is, what is the organization that's really successful at producing accessible digital products? What does that look like? And why does it matter? So accessibility maturity is a measure of that organization's capability to deliver and sustain accessibility. Um, and it's a measure, or the beginning of it is a measure of the current state and planning a path for ever evolving and improving future states. And we're going to get into more detail as we go along. Some of the qualities that we tend to see in mature organizations, just so we sort of know what good, I shouldn't say good, but we know what mature looks like, right? One is that it has leadership support, and I'm on the phone with organizations all the time, and one of the biggest, I just had this conversation the other day with a large organization, and they said, "How do we get support for this?" They were doing accessibility in a pretty reasonable way, but they were kind of stuck at that place. And part of the reason why they were stuck is just getting other parts of the organization to agree to kind of move to something different and better. And one of the key aspects of changing that is having support among leadership. And there's a lot of ways to get support among leadership. First of all, conversations with them. Oftentimes I recommend people have lots of conversations with their leaderships, and eventually you'll identify that leader that has a stake in accessibility. So they may have somebody in their family with a disability, they may have a disability themselves, but they'll have some reason why it's important to them. And that can be a great foothold into getting that leadership support. And then, of course, leveraging the people in your organization that have disabilities, because they can be the best evangelists and really give leadership some of the clearest pictures of why accessibility is important. The other thing that we see is it's expressed as a core value. So it's not an afterthought. It's not something somebody does. It's not something that people should try to include. It's really somewhere in the statements of the organization. It's a core value and quality that they're looking for. It's understood as a shared responsibility across the organization. So you kind of moving away from that, oh, this is the person or this is the group that handles accessibility, to what should we be doing for accessibility, whether you're creating documents, whether you're writing code, whether you're QAing code, whether you're in HR and you're trying to make sure that employees with disabilities have what they have. What is my responsibility in my role to contribute to accessibility across the organization? Policies and practices are considered, are constantly followed and reliable. And this really comes down to creating those policies and procedures and having some sort of a governance, just like you do with any other thing that's important to the organization, to make sure that they do. So they don't fall by the wayside. There's so many competing priorities. It's really easy for something to come along and push accessibility aside if it is not baked into processes, policies, procedures, and governed in the way that other important things are. Tools and resources are available for stakeholders and groups. All this stuff is great, but if people don't have what they need to include accessibility, then that can be a big bottleneck or a barrier, right? It can just stop the progress. So you really want to make sure that you're talking with stakeholders and putting tools and resources in place that they need. And then efforts are measured and data is used to prioritize improvements. Like any effort, it's really important to have KPIs. It's really important to measure those KPIs, and what those KPIs are will vary from organization to organization. But looking at how successful you are at meeting those and how successful you are at putting accessible product out and having ways of measuring that also gives you ways to improve, right? It gives you a benchmark to improve against. So let's take a look at accessibility maturity. And the first thing I want to talk about is the accessibility maturity model. I mentioned at the top of this that this is that I'm a member of this working group. Everybody this week is at TPAC, which is the Big W3C annual get together where all the working groups that are doing all this wonderful work have a chance to chat with each other in real life, right? IRL. So a lot of my colleagues and friends who are doing this work are there today now. I was unable to make it, but hope to make it in future years. And this is the TPGI model. This is our model based on the W3C's work. And right now, the W3C model is not complete. It's in draft form, but we're starting to pick it up as an organization and use a lot of the elements because it's very good. So these 4 levels, so the picture on the screen here is of a line graph with a straight line that's increasing as it goes along the x-axis. And it's got 4 stages. Level 1 is interactive, level 2 is launch, level 3 is integrate, and level 4 is optimize. And these are the very stages that, or levels that the W3C model has identified in their current working draft. So the other thing to think about is that there's more than one area in your organization to consider when it comes to maturing the capabilities. So in other words, oftentimes when we think about digital accessibility, we really think about the ICT, right? The Information and Communication Technology group. Or to be more specific, sometimes we're thinking about that software development lifecycle and we go, this is where it all goes. And it is probably where most of the effort in digital accessibility goes. But if you don't have purchasing, for example, on board, they may be procuring products that you would include, like a third-party tool that you would include on, let's say, your public-facing website, and that third-party tool might not be accessible. So while you've done a great job of building an accessible website, the things that you're adding to it aren't accessible. So do you have a policy in the purchasing department? And a lot of people don't stop and think about that. How does your, how does the legal department look at things? So and then if you're thinking about accessibility across your organization as a whole, there's obviously several places that you need to look at. So the dimensions that are identified by the model are communications, knowledge and skills, support, ICT, which we just talked about, personnel, procurement, and culture. So let's take a look at a rough accessibility maturity continuum as it's applied to one dimension of the organization. And the dimension we're going to look at is that ICT dimension. You can think of it like as the software development lifecycle, because I do think it is the most pertinent. But, keep in the back of your mind that if you don't start to look at other dimensions like purchasing, like legal, that you may still have some kind of bumps in the road as you try to produce accessible products. So we're going to look at the ICT development lifecycle, information and communication technology, the development lifecycle. This is the incorporation of web software and hardware accessibility considerations in the development process. And we're going to look at it from idea conception to design to development to testing to ACR production. ACR is the output of a VPAT. So a VPAT stands for Voluntary Product Accessibility Template. It's a common way, particularly business to business, that that organizations describe their level of accessibility to the WCAG guidelines. The ACR is Accessibility Conformance Report. It's basically a filled out VPAT. User research, maintenance, and obsolescence. So the maturity process as applied to ICT, we're going to look at it kind of in this basic journey, and that is to identify, prioritize, inject, and integrate. So identify is really identifying and repairing accessibility issues based on achieving conformance standards. So the W3C also gives us the WCAG Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And those guidelines are a way to start to look at your products and understand if they're accessible. And it's a great initial benchmark or goal to try to meet those guidelines at a very high level. That is not at all to take away from the importance of also having people with disabilities try to utilize your products and give you feedback on the usage. Just because you can apply with the guidelines doesn't necessarily mean that you have a greatly usable product. It's a very, very good start towards accessibility, though. Prioritize. So prioritization really centers around evaluation and repair activities based on real world impact on people. So oftentimes what we see is that people come in, organizations will have somebody like us come in and do an accessibility audit. And there's a lot, right? You could have anywhere from a few months to over a year worth of work, depending on the size of um, the asset that they're looking at and the number and severity of issues within that. So you can really be looking at something that's extremely arduous. And what you don't want to do is you don't want to get analysis paralysis, right? A good accessibility audit will give you a lot of information around those issues, including overall impact, right? Overall severity of the issue. So is it something that's kind of an inconvenience, or is it something that's a real showstopper, meaning that if a screen reader user hits this area, they're just dead in the water, so to speak. They're not moving beyond it. Or is it something in between those two things? Obviously, the more severe that issue is, the more you want to prioritize it. And you want to look at things like, where is that issue? Is it on our homepage? Is it in our nav? Or is it kind of buried off in some corner that people rarely touch? Obviously, that issue that is replicating in the navigation or that people are going to run to as soon as they land on the homepage is a much higher priority issue than that one that maybe is kind of off on a page that most people don't go to and maybe hard to find. And then who does it affect? What types of people with disabilities does it affect? And also how easy is it to fix, right? You're going to have the quickest impact on the accessibility of the site if you're fixing the issues that are easier to fix first, that are high priority, right? That's gonna close as much of the gap as possible as quickly as possible. And then, of course, looking at things like, do you have areas of the website that are deprecating? Is the website itself deprecating? Website application, the asset itself. If it's going to take you 8 months to fix something that's deprecating in 9 months, it may make much more sense to do a small amount of work on that, maybe uncover through automation or something, some of the real low-hanging fruit to fix, and then take your budget, your time, and your efforts and put those towards creating the new product, right? Inject. So when we say inject, we mean to start injecting accessibility best practices into the design, development, and content creation process, including documents. So really, most people start on production, meaning things that already exist, websites that are already out there, and retroactively they're trying to make them accessible. Even if you're in the midst of that process, right, you're probably making changes to those assets. Most websites, most applications aren't stagnant. So immediately start thinking about, well, what do we do in the earlier phases like design, QA, development, to start to A, catch issues, but B, code for accessibility, include accessibility in the design, so that we're not fixing issues in one place while accessibility issues are kind of flooding in from another place. And then, of course, hopefully this entire effort turns on its head a bit so that in the future, all of it is about eliminating accessibility barriers early on in that software development life cycle. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. And that's really the integrate, right? I jumped ahead to integrate. So integrate is through that activity, starting to look at shifting left when it comes to accessibility and having tools and DevOps in your CI/CD pipeline that can catch that low-hanging fruit that's able to be detected through automation, having your QA staff looking for accessibility issues in a more manual way, maybe some screen reader testing, keyboard testing, all those manual things that many of you are probably familiar with. And making sure that your developers have the proper education and resources to code with accessibility so that you're catching issues when it's inexpensive and easy to do long before it hits production. As we all know, production is the most expensive place to fix any kind of issue or any kind of bug, and accessibility issues are no different, right? So let's take a look really quick at the different elements that we see in every accessibility maturity program, right? So this is a program to mature your accessibility and get to kind of some of these states that we talked about. So independent asset review and remediation support. And this is really the ability to monitor, to review on a cadence the assets and having the information that you need and the support that you need to fix those issues. Review and remediation are iterative. So what I mean by that is in the beginning, you may say, geez, we've got this whole big website, we got to fix the whole thing. Ultimately, you want to be in more of an iterative approach, and you may actually even approach that first thing iteratively. The big projects tend to be just that, big projects, right? Where sustainable process tends to be smaller efforts that are occurring more often. And again, this all goes with shift left, but even when you're looking at something in production, if you're looking at one user flow and then remediating that one user flow and then going on to the next user flow and so on down the line, you're much less likely to have issues go stale. If you look at all 8 user flows, we'll say on the website, and it takes you 8 months, it takes you 12 months to get down to the final prioritized issues. By the time you get down to those, they could be stale, meaning that so much has changed on the site that that audit and the information in that audit's no longer as relevant. So we really see mature organizations tend to operate in much more of an iterative way. Tools and resources to support accessibility content creation. So this is really having supplied all the different stakeholders, not only with the tools that they need, and these could be automated tools to detect issues from single page scanners to large scanners that look across the whole site, to scanners that look at specific things like specific user flows and actually interact with the user flow like a user while scanning, so they can look at dynamic elements. And it could be tools like screen readers, or we have a tool called JAWS Inspect, which sort of accelerates that screen reader review process. So there's all sorts of tools to look at, but also resources. I may be a developer and I may really be good at including accessibility in my code, but I'm going to need to look something up. I'm going to need to look a best practice up at some point. So do you have a way to do that kind of thing? Role-based training. So this is making training available, whether it's self-paced training on the web, whether it's instructor-led training, but training where you can take these different roles and make sure that they get the information they need to perform their job and to include accessibility in their job. So training your developers, training your QA staff, training leadership, project managers, all those types of folks. Policy and procedure development, and this really speaks to including accessibility in everything, right? Whether it be other dimensions or other process areas like procurement or the software development lifecycle. It's one thing to train somebody how to code accessibly. It's another thing to say that our policy is to code in this way, which includes accessibility. So having those policies and procedures created and in place and obviously enforced. And then involving people with disabilities in the design and development process. There's a saying amongst us accessibility people, nothing about us without us. And that's what this means, that we can look at the guidelines, we can, as a group of folks, maybe that don't have disabilities, or even if we do have disabilities in the group, are they representative? I have dyslexia. It doesn't mean that I can inform or express the experience of a screen reader user very well, right? So do we also have screen reader users in the process? But it's so important, especially when you start to get beyond those first phases of just remediating your sites to the guidelines. And then all of this should be monitored, right? Everything, as you move along and you start to implement these things, it's very important to develop KPIs like the average number of issues per page. Is that decreasing? Are we, are complaints decreasing? Do we have, what number of our assets are actually hitting the public or the market, in a way that's accessible, and so on and so on and so on. And the KPIs will vary a little bit according to each organization. And then evangelizing with leadership, getting that support in leadership. Leadership can make everything happen and overrule anything. So if you don't have leadership support, you're always in danger of the program changing, right? And usually not for the better. So having somebody in leadership that's as passionate as you are about it, and that is having those discussions amongst their peers, and is really advocating for this effort to be developed at the level that we're talking about today. So every company's process is different, and I think this is really important. I would love to sit here and give you like a list of very specific things that every company can do, and just say, oh, run off and go do these things and you're all set. But the bottom line is that every company operates differently. Every software development lifecycle looks different. What needs to be done is different. The talent and capabilities within the organization are different. So we really want to think about what accessibility means and what accessibility means, maturity means to each individual organization in its unique way. So no two sites, applications, or digital assets are exactly the same alike, or will have the same set of issues. And that also means or the same set of best practices. So even if you develop best practices, even if you develop component libraries, design libraries, those are going to be very, very different. So even the education that a developer may need, for example, might be slightly different from one organization to the next. It's important to assess where you are before embarking on any changes. So really understanding what capabilities. I'm gonna guess, I think we have over 100 people listening right now. I'm gonna guess amongst all of you that you're thinking about your organization right now, and to some degree you are doing or have done accessibility. That's fantastic, because you have the seeds of all this stuff sitting in the organization. So what you don't want to do is you don't want to just start putting together a program and plowing ahead. You do want to take a step back and do some assessment, not only to find out where you're already doing accessibility and the lessons that you could learn from that, and the things that you can implement and improve upon and expand on based on that. But you also want to assess the different roles, so that you understand all the different roles in your organization, you understand what people are responsible for, and you understand how those different stakeholders will need to include accessibility as part of their job. So just sort of starting on maturity is okay, but at some point you really need to take a step back and do that assessment. And of course, that's something that we can help you with, right? TPG's expert consulting, training tools, and hand-on support. We can guide your organizations towards that greater accessibility. So if you're sitting here going, how do I do all that? Most people don't necessarily know. But there is the W3C working draft, that maturity model that you can look at. And then of course, organizations like TPGI can come in and put some of these plans together in place for you. So where are you in your journey? Different dimensions, maybe at different levels. So if you remember, we looked at all those dimensions and we've talked about process areas like legal and purchasing. And even across your software development lifecycle, it's not perfectly linear, right? You may have your development team may be really good at including accessibility, but nobody's really integrated it into QA yet, or you're not really monitoring on the production site, or maybe the SDLC is pretty good across the board, but you've got that previous example where purchasing is doesn't have any policies around it, so they're pulling in products that are less accessible than they could be. Um, so just recognize that you might have different levels when you're measuring your maturity. Sometimes it's important to measure based on those dimensions, so you really have an understanding of where the overall organization is, but the work that needs to be done in the different dimensions. The first step for many is an accessibility review, but like I just said, a lot of you may be past that. That you may have done that quite often and be like, this is where we're stuck, is in this review, remediate, sort of fall off, and then review, remediate, and fall off again cycle. So I'm guessing a lot of you all are past that. Again, what have you learned from that? What have you learned about your organization from that? And really what you're looking at is starting to integrate beyond that, right? Understand where you are, identify where you want to be, and then focus on the next small step that heads in that direction. Don't get overwhelmed by the big picture. If there's anything, if you're taking notes right now, like this is the one to circle and star. The biggest thing that I see is people look at this and they go, there's so much to do, how do we get there? And you're not wrong, there is a lot to do, but you don't want to let that overwhelm you. The biggest and best thing you can do is find the next little tiny step that makes sense. Put your blinders on for a period of time and do that, right? The one thing that we know is not doing anything is not going to get you anywhere, and it's not going to help advance your organization, your products, and it's certainly not going to help with the inclusivity um, of your products. So do something, even if you're wrong, even if it's not the best thing that you could have done, you'll figure that out and you'll adjust. But take that most logical step in your mind, small step forward that you can. And if you do nothing from here, if you have one note that you follow, that is the one. And it's sort of the, you know, any journey analogy that you want to insert here, where you just need to keep stepping forward, and each step is very, very, very small. Um, so let's look at building a program for scale. So you want to start with iterative and continuous tests, and you want to, if possible, you want to stop thinking in terms of full audits necessarily, right? Maybe there's small assets where full audits are appropriate, but really starting to look at how can we be doing this in smaller, more manageable chunks that we learn from. It's that sprint, it's that agile approach. And how can we start to move away from the do a large audit, fix it, have that degrade, and then come in and kind of do that process again. And a lot of that will be fitting it into your software development lifecycle. But even when you're working with a third party vendor like us, it may be saying, hey, you know, there is 200 components across this whole asset. I think what we want to do is we want to do user flows that have between 10 and 20 components in them each. And we'll look at that user flow and fix those issues, just like I talked about before. And there is a lot of advantages around that being manageable, and things not going stale and not getting overwhelmed, right? Not having somebody look at the huge audit and think, oh, we've got other priorities, we're going to set this aside for a minute. It's much easier to fit those small pieces in. Monitor through automation. So no matter, we all know that manual reviews are the only thing out there that's complete, and you've got to do them, but they take time. They take money to execute. Automation, you can monitor much more frequently, much more inexpensively, and you can keep an idea, going, or a measurement going, of the overall accessibility using that data set that can be collected through automation as a benchmark. So even if you're fixing issues through a manual, based on what you found in a manual review, that automated subset of those issues is also going to change. So you can be measuring progress. You can be looking for use it as the canary in the coal mine. So when issues are injected based on changes being made, any kind of regression occurring, you'll see spikes in the automated issues that alert you that something's occurred. And generally speaking, like I know with our ARC platform, you can actually go through and figure out, when they happened, where they happened, why they happened, and sometimes they lead to process changes. Maybe it's content that's jumping up the accessibility issues, and you realize, man, we trained our developers and we have all these policies in place, and that's going great, but we kind of forgot about our content creators. We need to get some education and tools, resources to our content creators, or whatever the situation might be. But really detecting that regression is an important part, and then evangelizing and we keep repeating it because it's so important, but that executive sponsorship. And then building the initial capabilities for scale, that is really around supplying role-based training, policy and procedure development, adding tools for manual QA. So we talked about JAWS Inspect. JAWS Inspect creates instant transcripts of what JAWS would speak on a page versus listening. So it can really speed up that process of screen reader testing. I always recommend you have a screen reader in there as well. And then shifting automated left into the CI/CD pipeline and building that internal culture around accessibility. None of these things happen overnight, right? We've always got to go back to, this is great. What is my next small step in this process? And then building advanced capabilities for scale, adding accessibility review into the design phase. So, instead of fixing it at production or even in coding, looking at those design comps, catching issues that may be detectable in the design early on, but also using that as an opportunity to annotate and inform the developers in terms of what they should do when they code to include accessibility, things like tabbing order and those sort of things. And then require accessibility and development and provide tools. So the policies and procedures and development, we have the world's sort of most robust knowledge base out there. So having that library of best practices, building component libraries, design libraries, and making sure they have tools like our ARC Toolkit where they can scan a single page for accessibility issues. So if they're trying to catch those issues early on, or if they're fixing issues and want to see if they're making progress, and Toolkit even has tools that go beyond that automated scanning and help with some of the more manual aspects of it, like overlays for tabbing order and things like that. So having those level of tools in development. And then and don't forget about QA, right? Just because developers are adding it into the code, you want to make sure that QA is starting to be able to do some of those manual access, even if you're using a third party, because most people still want that third party validation at the end of the day. And some people need things like ACRs from that VPAT format to be created. Even if you're doing that, you don't want us to find much, right? That's the whole idea, because when we tell you something's wrong and you have to go fix it, that's typically towards the end of that software development lifecycle, and it's expensive and it's a whole bunch of work that you would rather not have to continue to do. So integrating, teaching your QA staff to do a lot of what an organization like us would do is so important, so that they're really cleaning that up, and we're only catching maybe, the really advanced issues or things that slip through the cracks. And then the last thing, and this is how I really, if I see this one thing or hear this one thing when I talk to an organization, I sort of automatically know that they have a very mature accessibility progress. I automatically know that accessibility is baked into their policies, their procedures, their software development lifecycle, and their culture as a whole. And that is when they're contributing to the larger accessibility community. This should be the brass ring that you're going for. improving and maturing accessibility to such a degree in your organization that you become a thought leader. And when you're going to accessibility conference, or you start going to accessibility conferences, not just to gain knowledge that you need yourself, but because you have something to tell that community, and that's where you become speakers and experts, and you're contributing to those things. And it's really a wonderful place to end up. And you certainly don't have to wait to the end of your journey to do it. But if you're doing that at earnest at all, it means that you're really advancing your program, or your program's really advanced, I should say. I've mentioned some of these things along the way, but just to give you an idea of the type of things that TPGI has that can help, we have TAS, TPGI as a service. This is really an ongoing program to help organizations with continuous accessibility and maturing accessibility, and keeping accessibility top of mind. So it's an ongoing scalable program. The ARC platform is part of it. ARC platform is our large platform that's a single source for accessibility that does things like monitoring. So it centralizes that accessibility. We have the Knowledge Center, we have the monitoring, and we have a lot of automated and manual tooling that is part of that too. And then program management and maturity. So we can do that on a kind of a solutions architect, project management level, but we can also come in and look at your organization and set up a roadmap to mature it. So just a few things to think about. And of course, you can always reach out to us if you want more information on that. My email address is mmiller@tpgi.com. And we also have info@tpgi.com that you're welcome to reach out to. So with that, thank you all. And Carrie, I think you're probably still there. Do we have any questions from the group?
Yeah, it looks like we got one comment and one question in the
So if you've been
Q&A.
holding your questions, please add them to the question, or right now, as Carrie.
Q&A box.
Q&A box. Thank you. As Carrie
Um,
going through these.
so we've got a comment, then a question. So before scaling, getting to know where the client is very complex. Number one, find the persons that have the knowledge to evaluate the current situation, products,
Mhm.
people, tools, processes. Number two, get an objective evaluation. And then only number three, map it. Then comes setting SMART goals and KPIs. Will you share methodology to assess the current maturity before scaling?
Yeah. So there's a lot of good resources out there. If you look at and I have some of them too, you can ping me, but if you look at like CMMI models, so capability maturity models, so when you look at something like the W3C's model, the capability maturity model, and all these other maturity models for that are general maturity models, those are out there, and those help inform have helped informed us in terms of how to do the accessibility maturity model within the W3C. But they actually have scorecards, right? So you can go through those different process areas, and you can look through, you can utilize these scorecards. And I recommend, we've got some that we've done for accessibility, but I really recommend kind of, customizing whatever you do, so that you can go into each one of these areas and really see what they're doing. So if we think about the software development lifecycle, how educated are the developers? Is it in QA? What tools exist? Is it being monitored? Are there KPIs like, the average number of issues per page that a scanning tool can find that you can use to measure that progress? Is that in place? Are there policies and procedures in place? Looking at all of those things, and you can have these scorecards, and some of them will even line up to maturity levels. And they're a great place to start to understand where you are. And then, of course, that informs where you need to be. And, early in the presentation, I kind of made that point that different process areas may be at different levels. And that's where you really find that out. You may have a pretty mature ICT, but maybe, culturally it's not baked in very well, procurement's not, those kind of things. And typically that's the way it goes. So I like that question. That was good clarity. Was
All
there
right,
another
we got,
question in there too, Carrie, or is that all?
yep, we got one more submitted. Can you share any examples of CI/CD tools to monitor accessibility as we commit code?
Yeah, so within, for example, within our Arc platform, we have open KPIs and we have playwright capability. So that can integrate into your CI/CD tools like Jenkins, Azure DevOps, to include those checks when code's being checked in. Um, so there's quite a bit out there in terms of taking those automated, what are called rule sets. So rule sets are the set of rules by which automation detects issues. That's kind of the foundation or the engine of any tool that's scanning or checking for errors. So when you go use like Arc Toolkit, which is that's our free tool that's downloadable on the web that I talked about. You can use it in any browser. So that's got the same rule set, for example, as the Arc platform, which is the platform that's going to do the more, the deeper, more sophisticated scanning or the active user flow monitoring, right? So there's, we can take those rule sets and include those checks in, within whatever process you're using within that CI/CD pipeline.
And it looks like that was it. I'm not seeing any other questions going through the Q&A box or the chat.
Great.
So I think we can wrap things up. Mark, thanks for a great session. Everyone, thanks for joining us today. Again, recording the session will be sent out later this week. If you have additional questions, please feel free to reach out to Mark, reach out to info@tpgi or ida@tpgi.com. And we will get any additional questions that you ask answered. And please be on the lookout for our next upcoming webinars.
Thank you, Carrie, and thank you everyone for listening. As Carrie said, I'm happy to answer questions after the fact. So please shoot me an email, mmiller@tpgi.com.
Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day.